All right, so we're going to do just a quick rundown here on the interface, and we're going to need to have a little bit of geometry on screen to make some of the things that I described make a little bit more sense. So we're going to start by actually creating a file, and we'll use that default Canada, US Canada template that we've just put in place in our sort of easily accessible file location. So make sure again that you're clicking here up here in Projects, use the default US Canada, and you'll see this when it opens up. Now, the first thing I'll have you do is just to kind of mimic what you see on screen here. Let's move the project browser. It typically is over here underneath the Properties window. It has some kind of snapping and docking functions that will allow it to just kind of sit right below there. But I want you to just grab it by the title at the top where it says Project Browser, and let's pull it over to the other side. Now, this is admittedly kind of a personal preference thing. In the early stages of a project, it doesn't really matter that this is separate from this, but eventually what's going to happen is we're going to have a project that has all sorts of additional views in it, additional floor plan views and sections and details and all the rest, 3D views. So it starts to get to be kind of a long list, and it'll be a little bit inconvenient to have it located underneath Properties where you need to constantly be scrolling to access the view names. But again, that's personal preference. You might be fine with just leaving it underneath the Properties window. All right, so I'll elaborate on that a little bit more. This is one of the most important elements of the Revit interface, something that you wouldn't be accustomed to seeing in another program. The project browser, as you can assume already, is where we stash all of our views. So as we work on the 3D model and we need to go to different views to see what those drawings will look like, we use the project browser. So it's one of those things that just stays open all the time. Other little windows will be kind of context sensitive, come and go, but the project browser and the properties windows are two that you want to have open all the time. Notice that there's a little X beside each of them. So there's an X beside project browser and there's an X beside properties. If at any point you accidentally close those and you want to bring them back, just go up here to the View tab, and over on the right, the far right, there's a button that says User Interface, and you'll just want to make sure that you check again Properties and Project Browser and have those visible. Okay, so I'm going to elaborate a little bit more now on what the major components of this interface are. You'll often hear me call out certain tools or functions or processes that involve a tab and a panel. I've already done this a little bit. So across the top here we have tabs. This is the Architecture tab, Structure, Steel, Systems, Insert, and on. Within each of those tabs we have panels. There's a subtle gray line that separates all of the tools. So you can see here between mullion and railing there's a little gray line. So those separations mark the end of a panel. So when I describe, for example, that I want you to go to the, let's say, Massing in Site tab and the Model Site panel, look for the text across the top to mark the tab. The text across the bottom marks the panel. So quite a lot of what we'll do will be on the Architecture tab and on the Build panel. So whatever I say second, that one's a little bit harder to spot. Just look for that text along the bottom. So tab and panel, that's kind of the convention for calling out the locations of tools. In addition to that, of course, as you've seen, I've also got this little kind of cursor locator that should help you spot where I'm going. So as we mentioned, the similarities with AutoCAD, we have this ribbon, and the ribbon consists of the tabs and the panels. On each of the panels, we have tools. So on the Architecture tab and the Build panel, we have a wall, door, window component, column, roof, and on. All those are the tools. Some of the tools, when they're a little bit more elaborate, a little more complex, have a little pull down. So wall, for example, if you click on that bottom part, that little pull down arrow, you'll see that you have additional types or subcategories of the wall tool. Most of the time, we'll just be doing a regular old wall. So if I don't say anything about a pull down, and I just call out a tool like do a roof or a floor or a wall, just click the top part of the button. One other thing I should point out here is if at any time you accidentally click and your ribbon looks really different, much briefer, a little more edited perhaps, or maybe barely even there, It's because you may have accidentally clicked on this little button at the end of those list of tabs. So there's kind of two parts to it, but if you just click on that left part, it just toggles between the 4 different modes here of visibility for the ribbon. One is completely invisible, and then right after that we get back to the more typical sort of display. This is the one that I'll use consistently. It's a little bit more easy for you to look up on screen and see what's going on. I suppose after a while, once you kind of memorize where things are, you might try to get yourself a little bit more space on screen and simplify or reduce the icon list. But for the most part, you'll just see it on my screen like this. So that's the ribbon with the tabs and the panels and the tools. In the upper left, we have what they call an application menu. So that blue R Revit icon gives you access to a couple of different basic functions. If you're looking at an older tutorial prior to 2019, the File button, the options that are available there, and the application menu are the same thing. They've separated them for 2019. So if you just go right below that and click on File, you'll see that you have access to all those typical sort of Windows tools: new, open, save as, undo, export, print. Pretty basic, as you would expect it to be. And we also saw before how we had an Options button. We have one here as well. And like other Windows and Autodesk products, we have a list of our recent files here as well. We will move across here to the top. This is what's called the Quick Access Toolbar. We have some, as the name suggests, quick access ways of getting to open and save, undo, redo. We have a print tool here as well. This is an important tool along the top. This is your default 3D view. So that was the one that we clicked on when we wanted to go from looking at our plan view walls to our 3-dimensional walls. And eventually you'll have another way of creating a 3D view. We'll get to that in a bit. And some other things that we'll get to once we get into some of the details of more of the tools. So that's the Quick Access Toolbar and the application menu. We've talked about the project browser window, which I've got stashed over here on the right. The properties window, pretty straightforward. Not unlike AutoCAD, it just displays all the properties for whatever object you may have selected. If you don't have an object selected, it'll just display the properties for the view, including things like the view scale and then some other graphic display options. Right here on the bottom left is the view control bar. We looked briefly at how you can set the scale. That's the first button that you'll see. And let's create some geometry first, and then I'll kind of explain what these other buttons are about. So I'm in my level 1 floor plan view. So over in my project browser, you can see that I have level 1 selected. You can actually click on the other views and not make them active. It's just the one that has the bold highlight that is the actual active view. So I'll make sure I'm in level 1, and like we did before, I'm just going to click on the wall tool. So in the upper left, Architecture tab, Build Panel, click on the top part of the wall tool. And what happens when you activate that tool is the Properties window displays a type selector. And if you click on that, you can see there's a little pull-down triangle beside it. It allows you to choose different wall types. Now this is a list that you can populate with other wall types. We'll get to that eventually. But for now, I'm just going to choose the exterior brick on metal stud. I'm going to then, here in the options bar, so this wasn't there before, but as soon as you activate tools and select objects, you'll see this special kind of context-sensitive option bar appear, giving you a little bit more, as the name suggests, some options for that object. What I'm going to do here is just change the height from the default state of being unconnected to level 2. So now when I create my walls, rather than just being 8 meters or some random height, they're going to be constrained to level 2, and I'll show you what that means in just a second here. So having selected that wall type, specified that its height is level 2, I'm going to click on this rectangle tool and just create a simple set of walls. Now we'll look at that in 3 dimensions in just a bit here, but before we get to that, we'll elaborate more on what this view control bar is all about. So we saw the scale already. Right next to that is the detail level. Typically when you want to draft, you want to leave it at the detail level, of course. It simplifies things, it makes it a little bit more sort of draft friendly. But when you're creating the model, you'll probably want to see more information than this. So I'm going to switch this from the detail level coarse to detail level fine. And when you do that, you'll then see that it adds a little bit more information graphically for what's going on with your walls. So you'll actually see the layers in the walls now, where before you just saw the inside and the outside. In addition to that, beside that button is the visual style button. So if you click on that little cube down there in the bottom left on the view control bar, you can choose any one of these 6. For now, I'm just going to select shaded. I'll show you what those other ones do. Typically, you're going to work in either hidden line or shaded. Those are the most common ones. Shaded just simply adds a little bit of color. So once again, just a little bit more information, a little more detail on what you're creating. Allows you to kind of confirm that you've got things in the right spot. So it's very common to build your model in this fine level of detail with the shaded option selected. Okay, now we can go to another view. We'll click on our little default 3D view up here on the quick access toolbar, that little kind of axonometric house. And like it did before, it takes us to a 3D view. And you can see here in the default 3D view that it actually displays the levels. This is a new thing for 2019. Prior to 2019, it didn't do this. You just basically saw the model on its own without the level datum lines. We can do the same thing here that we did in the floor plan. We can change the detail level to fine, and we can set the visual style to shaded. And it just gives us a little bit more information. Not crucial when we've got a simple model like this, but certainly once it gets really busy, you'll appreciate all those little graphic clues to kind of help you understand what you're creating on your screen. Now, if you rotate around by, so on the visual style button down here on the view control bar, just click that. It'll show the 6 options and just choose the one in the middle that says shaded. Don't worry about the other ones yet. We'll get to those. The orbiting, you can do a few different ways. So if you hold down your shift button and your middle scroll button, and then you can just kind of wiggle those around and you can do your orbit. It keeps the object centered. Notice in the upper right side of the screen there, I've also got this little cube icon that's kind of tracking my movements with the mouse. That is the view cube. It's another example of something that's common to other Autodesk programs. And what you can do with the view cube is you can actually click on various parts of that and get these kind of preset 3-dimensional or even 2-dimensional views. So most likely you will just use the mouse, the scroll button, and the shift button to do your orbiting. But there will be times when maybe you want something a little bit more sort of precise. So you can use the view cube for that. You can scroll in and out like you can in AutoCAD, just with your scroll wheel. And you can pan by holding down your scroll wheel middle button. So those are the most typical ways that you navigate. And just a few other things that we'll look at here on the interface just to kind of wrap this up. We also have along the bottom the option of turning shadows on or off. So there's a little sphere. At the moment it's kind of got a blue tone to it with a little X. If you click on that, it'll just create some quick ray traced shadows. There isn't actually a physical ground yet, but it just assumes that it will be at the bottom of the building at level 0. Yep.
Can you change the height of your walls once you build it?
Yes, you can. So that's actually a good segue to making the point about the levels here. So notice that if I go to an elevation view, and the official way, the more formal way of doing that is to actually click in the elevation section of the browser. So if I double click on south, for example, you can see that the walls are actually constrained to be from level 1 to level 2. Nice thing about that is if I click on that level 2 and just manually drag it up or down, notice the walls go with it. So if you want to change the height of the walls, you can actually select them. So I'm in my south elevation view. You can click on those walls. And over here in the properties window, where it might say 8,000 millimeters, you can actually click here on top constraint and set that to be up to level 2. So that's something that you can kind of play with. Typically, you want to have your walls constrained to a level, just for the very reason I illustrated there. If you wanted to change the height of those walls, it'd be easier to just change the level as opposed to going into the project and changing the height of every single wall. Which brings me to this important element. In an elevation view, and as you saw in the 3D views, you'll see these level datum lines. And this was actually one of the things that came in with the template. One of the reasons why we chose that default US-Canada template is it just gives us a really basic set of levels. The levels have corresponding floor plan views associated with them. So here in the project browser, when I click on level 1, obviously I'm looking here at this level 1 datum line, which is the main floor. And if I went to level 2, I'd just be looking at the view, the floor plan view at the top of the walls. We'll look at how we can add additional levels and how we can kind of modify so that the walls don't go just to that point, but maybe miss it by a little bit. But levels are an important way of working in Revit. And typically with a project, you'll want to establish at least a basic framework for your levels at a very early stage and have all your floors and your walls and roofs and everything else linked to those levels. The last thing I'll mention here, just down on the very bottom left, we have a control panel. It doesn't do exactly or to the extent of what you would see in AutoCAD, but it's similar. It'll give you some prompts about maybe what it's expecting from you next. It'll maybe give you a highlight or some information about what you've selected. You don't use it in Revit as much as you do in AutoCAD, but it's the same kind of principle. And then down here in the bottom right, there's a few tools that we'll get to eventually. An important one is this little filter command. We'll come back to that later, but when we want to select something and it's just a tiny little thing that's hard to grab and it's around a whole bunch of other objects, we can select the whole batch and use the filter to just kind of refine our selection and get just that one object that we were looking for. So we'll come back and talk about filters later, but that's where that one is. Last thing I'll mention before I move into another subject here is the selection process in Revit. Notice that the default state of your cursor is this little white arrow. Now, it's the Modify tool. If you actually looked up here on the ribbon, you'd see that you had activated the Modify tool. And Revit is just always in this state where it's assuming that you're going to select an object and then make some modifications to it. As you hover over an object, you'll see that its edges take on a blue highlight. So that's just giving you a little prompt about what it would click and select if you were to actually press your button. And then once you do actually click, and then you'll see the whole object take on this blue highlight. So just pay attention to that kind of blue temporary highlight in the initial stage, and then the blue highlight the whole object takes on once you've actually selected the entire object. And that's just a basic look at how we do selections in Revit.